According to Chinese historical records, papermaking was introduced to Tibet from China around 650 AD, when a Tibetan king married a Chinese princess. Over the centuries, Tibetan papermaking spread throughout the surrounding areas, shown on this map, accounting for the techniques I've witnessed in 27 years of research in those places. I wanted to begin in Tibet, but travel there was forbidden, so I began my first expedition in Nepal. Subsequently, I researched traditional papermaking in Darjeeling and Sikkim in northern India, then Bhutan. In 1985, China relaxed its rules, and I explored Tibet itself for a month. And I finished with expeditions to the Tibetan parts of northern Yunnan and Sichuan provinces. All the time, I have been traveling through the mountains, literally on the top of the world. Not only overwhelmed by the magnificence of these mountains, but also fascinated by the people who live in those high, often remote places, and intrigued by their culture, their work, their skills, and arts. And it's exciting to find so many areas where paper is still made in traditional ways. In 1978, we flew over the Himalayas to Nepal. We see Mount Everest rising majestically. Here in Kathmandu, we photographed the famous Swayanbhatnath Stupa with its all-seeing eyes of the Buddha. I hoped to locate a village of hand papermaking, and I visited this marketplace to seek out information. I learned that if we drove north on the road to the Tibet border, we'd see a settlement of papermakers. We drove through the mountains on a narrow, paved road, fine until we reached an area devastated by landslides. Workers were fixing the road, removing huge boulders. Our car got stuck in the mud, and the kindly workers pushed us out. Further along, just north of the village of Barabis, as we descended into a valley, we saw this scene, hundreds of moles drying in the sun. Here we stopped, and for the first time I saw paper made by pouring pulp onto a floating mold. Before that, I had observed papermaking only in Japan, Europe, and the US, where paper was produced by dipping a mold into a vat of pulp. This woman is stripping the bark of the Daphne bolua tree, the paper plant of Nepal. The Daphne piled up here will be cooked for several hours with lye made from wood ash. The basket we see now is filled with ash. Water is poured through it, and a weak lye collects in the pail underneath. After cooking, they wash the fiber, and then the little boys of the village beat it to a pulp. It's certainly a good way to harness the energy of little boys. Now we watch the beaten pulp being thoroughly mixed with water in a wood trough. To form a sheet of paper, the papermaker is putting a simple wood frame with fabric attached down into the river. She's pouring a bowl of pulp now down on the floating mold and dispersing the pulp in the water that has filled the mold. When the pulp is evenly distributed, she very slowly picks up the mold, allowing the water to drain. Finally, the mold with its attached paper is brought out into the sun, and when the paper dries, she peels it off the mold. It's finished, ready for sale. This was my only visit here. Fortunately, I had thoroughly documented their papermaking because 2 years ago, in 2003, I learned that a terrible landslide had occurred, and this enclave of papermaking was completely destroyed. In 1986, our daughter Donna traveled through Nepal and had a different experience. First, she visited this cottage industry center in Kathmandu, where papermakers were learning the Japanese method of papermaking called nagashizuki. Then she made a difficult 2-day trek to the tiny village of Palam Sangu. There, she discovered she had to cross this suspension bridge to get to the papermaking area. She finally had courage to cross and photographed these papermakers making paper right in the river. Despite the papermaking school in Kathmandu, I noticed in my subsequent visits to Nepal that when I bought handmade paper in the markets, I could buy paper made either in the Japanese style or the traditional Nepalese pulp pouring method. In 1982, we returned to the Himalayas, this time to explore Sikkim in northern India and Bhutan. It's a thrill to see these mountains. That's Kanchenjunga, third highest mountain in the world. We stopped first in Darjeeling, India, to pick up our special permits to visit Sikkim. Darjeeling is fascinating, and the exotic marketplaces with its mix of Indians, Tibetans, Bhutanese, and Nepalese are extraordinary. I searched for handmade paper in the market and found some, but none was made in the surrounding area. We visited the nearby Tibetan Refugee Center, and here we located this former Tibetan papermaker, Adar Jondam. He explained that he emigrated from the Kongpu area of Tibet, where he made currency paper from Edgeworthia. In Darjeeling, he continued papermaking until his sources of fiber were used up. He still had some tools, and he's showing us the enormous hammer he used for beating, and the jatom, similar to a butter churn, that he used to disperse the beaten pulp in water. Now our permits were ready, and we drove by public bus for many hours through the mountains to Gangtok, the capital of Sikkim. Like Darjeeling, Gangtok is a vertical city built into the mountainsides. Here from our hotel, the Tashi Delek, we had another extraordinary view of Mount Kanchenjunga. We decided to drive up to Rumtek Monastery, which we heard had a printing establishment. We had a fantastic drive to reach this important and very elaborate center of Tibetan Buddhism. I learned that there were 4 papermakers outside the monastery, and we met a young monk whom we see here. He showed us the Daphne bolua tree that is used for the papermaking fiber, same as Nepal. We also met the English-speaking secretary to the Chief Lama. Both men took us to visit Chosum, the papermaker. We found that he originally came from Bhutan, which would be our journey the following week. From Chosum's house, we viewed this magnificent scene of the mountains and below the sculptured terraces. Chosum is demonstrating his papermaking process, which was quite similar to Nepal. We are watching him peel the inner bark, cutting out any knots or pieces of outer bark. He's pulling apart the bark into thin strands to shorten the cooking time. Here we see a basket of wood ash for cooking, and now Chosum is showing us the cooking, which takes 1 to 2 hours. Now watch closely. To form a sheet of paper, he drops a ball of pulp into a jatom, like we saw in Darjeeling, but a smaller version. He's adding several cans of water, and now he will mix the pulp and the water in the jatom. He works at it quite vigorously. And then he dumps the whole mixture onto the mold. Using one hand, he disperses the pulp evenly over the mold. When he decides that the sheet of paper is properly formed, he lifts the mold up to drain, and he's careful to let the water fall back into the pool. Water is scarce here. He stands the mold on end for drying, which can take a couple of hours depending on the weather. Here, Chosum is removing a dry sheet from the mold, peels it off, and hands it to his wife, and that's the whole process. We drove back to Siliguri in India to meet the van that would take us to Bhutan. In 4 hours, we arrived at the border city of Phuntsholing in Bhutan, where we stayed overnight, did some exploring, and started the drive to Thimphu, capital of Bhutan. There's Mount Chomolari in the distance. On the way, we observed Taksang Monastery, called Tiger's Nest, perched on the side of a sheer cliff 3,000 feet above us. We decided to go there. It was a remarkable adventure, first by donkey, then a long, hard trek and climb on foot to reach Taksang, but we made it. And I photographed my husband to prove it. 2 days later, we arrived in Thimphu, 1 day before Bhutan's National Day. and we saw groups practicing for the celebrations. This was held on the newly constructed airfield where Bhutan was awaiting its first airplane. Now it's just an hour's flight from India to Bhutan. We explored the markets and I bought an immense prayer book printed on handmade Bhutanese paper. But I could get no information about where paper was made. That night, however, we attended a big party at our hotel for the government officials attending the National Day celebration. I'm talking to Mr. Dege, the Minister of Forestry. He's the man on the right. The other man is a beggar. Mr. Dege was interested in my research and arranged for us to visit a papermaker in Dege. In 2 days, we were on our way in a pickup truck with a driver, a guide, a cook, and 2 live chickens that we ate during our expedition. While driving, we noticed an archery match. That's the national sport of Bhutan. The journey through the mountains was spectacular, with its views of sculptured terrace farmlands, and we admired the unique Bhutanese architecture. But the road was simply a rocky roadbed. We saw hundreds of Indian workers, including mothers with babies at their side, building the road. The Bhutanese don't do this sort of work themselves. As we approached Dochala Pass at more than 10,000 feet, we encountered more fog and now snow. It was frightening on this poor road. We picked up here a local guide who would lead the way to the papermaker. Here's our little group assembled. And finally, we reached Dege and located the papermaker, Yeshi Dorji. The weather was clear, but too cold for papermaking. He lives in an interesting little house, and he shows us his workshop and his methods of papermaking. He also uses Daphne bark, cooking it in wood ash. Here we see the cooking area. And he beats the fiber with these mallets. But the mold is entirely different. It's a wood frame with a detached bamboo screen laid on it. To form a sheet, he dips the mold into a vat of pulp and couches the sheet on his post of papers here. This was the method he had recently learned at a new papermaking school in Thimphu. He presses the post with the heavy rocks we see here and dries the damp sheets by brushing them on the walls of his house. Despite the isolation of Bhutan, papermaking was already changing in 1982, just as Donna had witnessed in Nepal. In 1985, I spent a month in Tibet, visiting the magnificent Potala Palace in Lhasa that we see here. It's the heart of Tibetan Buddhism. And also, we explored all the great monasteries that survived China's Cultural Revolution. I hoped to locate traditional hand papermaking, so I scoured the marketplaces and monasteries, but received negative responses about papermaking. At Samye Monastery, we see this incredible library of ancient books. At Tashi Lungpo, we hear these monks reciting from the Buddhist sutras. At Ganden, we observe old Tibetan currency on a donation table. And most important, we watch monks there printing the sutras. Unfortunately, they told us there was no paper made by hand here. Outside Ganden Monastery, however, among the yaks, I noticed a plant that I believed was the one used for Tibetan papermaking. With great difficulty, we managed to dig it out of the rocky soil, and I carried it around with me, hoping to get a positive identification. In Lhasa, I visited the Hospital for Traditional Tibetan Medicine and interviewed this doctor. He positively identified my plant as Stellara kaimijasmi, saying the root was traditionally used for papermaking. The doctors are showing me their library with ancient medical texts printed on the handmade Stellara paper. So I bought a big shovel at the market, hoping to dig up more plants. The next day, we left in an open truck for a 3-day stay on Mount Everest. We drove for hours through these barren mountains, past a glacier, and we had to stop here, and our group got off the truck to fix the little bridge. Meanwhile, I spotted some Stellara and started digging. Finally, we reached the furthest point that was feasible and set up our tents 18,000 feet above sea level, 2/3 of the way to Mount Everest Peak. Right now I've crawled out of my tent. Nothing grows here, however, and I found no more papermaking plants. But our view of the north face of Everest was awesome. And here I am beside my tent with the shovel that was very useful for digging a latrine. Northern Yunnan province in the Himalayas is spectacular, with its deep gorges, snow-capped mountains, terraced farms, waterfalls everywhere. We are on the way to Zhongdian, where there's an active Tibetan monastery. Unfortunately, we found no printing or papermaking here, but we did arrive when the monks were rehearsing for a festival the next day. Leaving Zhongdian, we are driving south to Lijiang, in particular to the Dongba Institute there. The institute is a museum and research center for the Dongba religion of the Nashi people, who inhabit this part of Yunnan province. Their religion is a combination of Tibetan Buddhism and Taoism. They have a written language consisting of pictographs. They're like hieroglyphics. It's mainly used by the religious leaders, the Dongbas, for their writings. Here's an artist at the Institute painting on handmade paper. At the Institute, I also saw students of Dongba writing the old Dongba pictographs. The Institute had a minor demonstration of Nashi papermaking, but we learned that the real place of papermaking is by Dege, and that was our next stop. We drove as far as we could through the mountain roads. Then we trekked to the village. We located the house of the papermaker here, and we were greeted by his father, Hershey Fa. The family dog got very excited. Mr. He tells us that it is mushroom month, and his son, the papermaker, is away selling mushrooms, much more profitable than making paper. But he describes the papermaking. They use the inner bark of Wickstromia, which they call string bush. It's almost identical with the fiber used in Japan, which the Japanese call gampi. They cook the fiber in the kitchen using lye made from ashes of rice straw. Then they beat the fiber on a log. Mr. He rounded up the tools, and he's giving us a wonderful demonstration of sheet forming in pantomime, hopping around on one leg. We left the papermaking house and trekked back through the forest. On the way, we see here the wild string bush growing. The next year, we returned to Baidi. It was April 2004. I made sure that it was not mushroom season. We see here the Stellar chimijasmi growing with yellow flowers, but the Nashi papermakers don't use it. They use only the string bush that we see here in the basket. The papermaker, He Yong Hong, is showing us how they cook the fiber on an open fire, right in their house. They had gathered the string bush branches themselves, stripped the inner bark, then pulled apart the bast fiber to produce thin strands. This shortens the cooking time. They are adding the soda ash, and now the cooking takes less than half an hour. They check the fiber to see if it's done, and now it is done, and the papermaker's wife is removing the pot from the fire, taking it outside. She is rinsing the fiber very thoroughly and brings it to her husband for beating. Yong Hong is beating a small quantity of fiber on a rock. It's enough for 3 sheets of paper. Meanwhile, his wife is getting rid of specks of black outer bark. Now He makes a sheet of paper. He puts the rigid bamboo screen in the box, puts the box into his wood vat. He just threw a ball of pulp in, which he is dispersing very vigorously in the water. He throws out a few bits of pieces that have collected on top of the pulp. Now he's finished, and slowly he raises the box from the vat, letting the screen drain. He places an empty board next to his vat, and now he removes the screen from the box. He spends several minutes pressing the screen with its sheet of paper against the board. See the water streaming down under the pressure of his hands. He does a little more adjusting. Now he removes the screen, and the paper will dry in the sun. When it's half dry, he will run a brayer over it, but we didn't have time to wait to see it. As we left, we examined these string bush branches that were specially laid out for us in the courtyard. In 2002, I learned from Swiss friends that hand papermaking still existed in eastern Tibet at the Pakong printing house in Dege. Dege is an important center of Tibetan Buddhist culture, but the Chinese government changed the provincial borders, so on the new maps, Dege is shown in Sichuan province. We are driving up from Chengdu to Dege, a 3-day trip through the mountains over rough terrain with fabulous scenery. One day, a sudden rainfall occurred, and below us we saw this unbelievable rainbow. We notice the strong Tibetan presence the whole way. There are prayer flags flying, chortens along the way, and at a monastery we faintly hear the monks praying. We have now reached our destination in Dege, the Pakong printing house that we see here. It's the largest printing establishment in China or Tibet for printing the Buddhist sutras. The workers we see are using wood blocks for printing. They have thousands of blocks that are centuries old, but they also carve new ones. There are dozens of workers in each room, turning out tremendous amounts of work. Mostly they use commercial paper, but special sutras are printed on handmade paper made here at the printing house. Across the street, we found the Tibetan papermakers, 8 women engaged in cleaning the fiber, removing the outer bark. On the far left is the leader of the group. She's the original Tibetan papermaker, and she taught her skills to the others. We are watching the entire process. First, the roots of the Stellara Kaimi jasmine, which we had first seen at Ganden Monastery in Tibet, are smashed with a hammer. The woody interior is removed and discarded, leaving the bast fiber that will be made into paper. The fiber is soaked in water first, and now they're cooking it on this stove for 2 hours using soda ash in the cook. 2 women have started beating the fiber with wooden mallets. The stone mortar here is more than 300 years old. When the pulp is sufficiently beaten, it's put into this cylindrical container that resembles a butter churn. That's the jatom that the Tibetan papermaker in Darjeeling showed us. The pulp is being mixed with water. After the mixing, the papermaker pours the pulp into a bucket. We often hear the papermakers sing as they work. Now we go out to the courtyard to see the sheet forming. The papermaker sets the mold in the water where it floats, and another woman has started to pour the pulp onto the mold. She puts in 3 dippers full, and the women then start dispersing the pulp in the water. They take out some extraneous particles. Now they are satisfied that they have an even sheet and raise the mold from the vat, letting it drain. One woman is carrying the mold away, and she puts it out in the sun to dry. The final step is removal of the dry sheet, as we see here. The sheets are very large, 27.5 inches by 39. The stellar fiber produces a crisp sheet, and we can hear the rattle of it. Our visit to Dege is finished, and I have fulfilled my goal. I have finally seen Tibetan papermaking in Tibet. And we start our 3-day drive through the Himalayas, back to Chengdu, and then home to Boston.